This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Everybody's arguing that it's this binary question of we're arguing about freedom of speech on social media. No, that wasn't what people were actually fighting about. They were really fighting about who got attention and whose content landed on the top of the feed. That was the fight that people were having. And so if we were going to talk about it, we should talk about it in those terms. I completely agree. But then you had to understand that there's no such thing as neutral, and we should have like a clear set of like a clear framework for understanding like what that meant and how users could have more power and visibility on platforms that are essentially controlled by, unaccountable private power.
The Village Square, a nervy bunch of liberals and conservatives who believe that disagreement and dialogue make for a good conversation, a good country, and a good time. At the Village Square, we talk about politics, religion, and race. You know, the topics your mom taught you never to discuss in polite company. Listen, at the Village Square, we make pigs fly.
Hey folks, welcome to Village Squarecast. This is Corey Nathan. I am so glad to be with you again. Thank you for joining us for Invisible Rulers with Renee DiResta. Disinformation, spam and scams, trolls, online manipulation, and what we can do about it. Funding for this program was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Check out Florida Humanities online at floridahumanities.org. I was so glad to see Village Square bring in Renee DiResta for this conversation. Her work with the Stanford Internet Observatory and now with the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown, it's been smack dab in the center of one of the, how to say it, the primary ills of our time. And that is the metastasization of manipulation, harassment, and targeting online, whether that's through influence operations. And Renee describes this in her book and in other talks. It's influence operations, spam and scams, or as she puts it, the novel ways of abusing generative AI technology. I actually first learned about Renee's work through a number of other scholars and leading voices in the field, such as friend of Village Square, Jonathan Haidt. It is such a timely, important conversation. I'm so glad Village Square's founder and president and my friend, Liz Joyner, got to spend this time with Renee. So with that, I'll turn it over to Liz and I'll pop back in before we wrap it up.
Good evening. I'm Liz Joyner, founder and president of the Village Square. And on behalf of the Village Square and Florida Humanities, we're delighted to welcome you tonight to Invisible Rulers, the people who turn lies into reality, with our very special guest, Renee DiResta. This program is made possible by funding from Florida Humanities through the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's part of a multi-year series of digital programs, UNUM, Democracy Reignited, presented in partnership with Florida Humanities, exploring the past, present, and future of the American idea as it exists on paper, in the hearts of our people, and as it manifests in our lives. If you are not familiar with the work of NEH and Florida Humanities, we're putting their web addresses in chat. Be sure to check them out. We have got a cool treat for you tonight in this last program of the 4th season of UNUM series. Florida Humanities Executive Director, Dr. Nasheed Majouan, is joining us to say a word. Welcome, Nasheed.
Hello, hello. Yes. Thanks for having me. This, Liz, is a wonderful partnership. 4 years of excellent discussions, the brightest minds and the perfect times, sensitive topics made real for our community. And as we explore the conversations that we need to have and the conversations that must occur at our kitchen table, the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, and as Florida Humanities as the affiliate, we feel proud that we are able to champion these discussions and address it across the 67 counties of the state of Florida. Unfortunately, in recent times, and to our listening audience, as you may or may not know, the support we have from the National Endowment for the Humanities has been placed at risk. In the meantime, as that is working out, Florida Humanities has erected a capital campaign, a campaign to fill in the gap. We lost about $1.7 million. That money allows us to bring Smithsonian exhibitions to Florida, a partnership with the Library of Congress Center for the Book, books for summer reading programs, exhibitions, lecture series, tours of underserved communities and unsung heroes around the state, remarkable stories. We are Florida storytellers, and we capture and share the story of Florida identity. Whether you are a seventh generation Floridian or a first generation Floridian, 20 plus million people in Florida, we love to tell the story, and we welcome you. We are excited to announce that we have funders, Hugh Culverhouse, the Mellon Foundation, and private supporters are coming to the charge. Our board of directors, our circle of friends, the Village Square, all of our partners are saying, we love to do this work. We love the work that Florida Humanities has been able to champion for the past 50 years. And
It's the heart and soul of Florida.
Yes,
And
yes.
you may not even know that you're attending something that was supported and made possible from Florida Humanities. You're all over the state everywhere.
Yes, yes. And that's a good point. It's not always about us. We want to support the good work of our partners. It's the best of brand partnership all the time, every time. But we make sure that the identity and the brand of museums, historical sites, libraries are at the forefront, and we are a partner to make sure their good work continues. And so at the end of this program, there will be a press release and a link so you can see the work that we provide. And we've been sharing around the state, Forum magazine, for 50 years, and we want to continue. We will continue, and with your support, we will champion these turbulent times. And thank you, Liz, for this opportunity to break into this wonderful program. And I will go back to being a fan of the
Well,
program. I
thank
will
you,
get in the
Nasheed.
link.
Thank you for making this program possible. We
Thank you. Thank
appreciate
you,
you.
Liz. Love you guys. Thank you.
Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest. Renee DiResta is an associate research professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. Previously, she was the technical research manager at Stanford Internet Observatory, a cross-disciplinary program of research, teaching, and policy engagement for the study of adversarial abuse in current information technologies. She studies the way people attempt to manipulate, harass, or target others online. Under the bipartisan leadership of the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, she led an investigation into the Russian Internet Research Agency's multi-year effort to manipulate American society. Renee was a principal at Seed Stage, a venture capital fund, O'Reilly Alpha Tech Ventures, and spent 7 years on Wall Street as an equity derivatives trader at Jane Street. She is the author of 2 books, The Hardware Startup, Building Your Product, Business, and Brand, and Invisible Rulers, the topic of tonight's conversation. Renee, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I want to put in a little plug, in case you don't, for your book,
Thanks.
Invisible Rulers. I really believe that this is one of the most important books that we can read right now. I think sometimes in this kind of high conflict environment, it's easy to get caught in the signal and in the noise and forget about the signal. And so to me, what you study, what you write about, it's what's transforming our society, and we better pay attention.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So let me start by just asking you, what is an invisible ruler?
So the term is a reference to Edward Bernays, actually, who was a propagandist for the U.S. government, the Creel Commission, in World War I. He was also Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he wrote this book. Yeah, he was Freud's nephew. He wrote this book in 1929, the book Propaganda. And at the time, the term wasn't a pejorative yet, right? This was before World War II, so it wasn't yet framed as like that thing the Nazis did. It was a term sort of for information with an agenda, and there was actually this idea that it was an obligation of the government to communicate to the people the complicated, realities of the world. There was Walter Lippmann was a contemporary of his around the time, and he talked about how people think and feel in different worlds, and it was actually the kind of obligation of the government to help bridge those gaps. So this was it sounds very paternalistic and controversial to say that a century later, but this was one of the ideas of the time. And so, invisible rulers comes from a sentence in Bernays' book, Propaganda, where he says there are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. And he has about a paragraph long discussion where he's arguing that our minds are made up largely by people we've never heard of. And the book is talking a lot about advertisers, marketers, people who shape the public mind. And the book rather seamlessly moves back and forth between marketing and political propaganda, because he doesn't really see a distinction between the two, actually. He sees it very much as you're shaping the public, you're shaping public opinion. And funny enough, Shaping Public Opinion was the name of one of Lippmann's books, Crystallizing Public Opinion. And so they have this idea, and they're writing this a century ago, just this idea that there are these people that you are unaware of whose job it is to influence you. And that was where the title of the book came from.
And so, I mean, it is like kind of a through line through the book that to me is just remarkable that, 80 and 100 years ago, we were dealing with these same issues with different new technologies.
Right. So one of the things that I wanted to connect the book to was the idea that propaganda isn't new. I didn't intend to be in academia. That happened sort of by accident. It happened through a series of kind of, strange events where I just was invited to participate in research projects just to answer interesting questions that I was interested in. And that was sort of how I wound up in academia. But as I was doing that, there was an entire terminology that was beginning to unfold. This was where misinformation, disinformation, there was conversations about Russia that began to happen around 2016 with the election and the sort of revelations about the Internet Research Agency. But one thing that I kept coming back to and feeling like, as a person with a computer science degree, it seemed to me like propaganda was actually the through line here, right? That it was a word that we had always had. It was a word that connected back to the time of the printing press, because that's actually where it comes out. The word emerges around the time when Pope Gregory makes this exhortation after the printing press and the Protestant Reformation, and he says to the cardinals, "You must go forth and propagate the faith." And he uses this very particular form of the verb, like an imperative. You must go forth and do this. You must propagate the faith, and it is the idea of propagation that is where the word comes from.
I did
And
not
it's the
know
idea,
that.
yeah. So it actually ties in directly to the aftermath of the printing press and the Catholic Church's realization, the Catholic Church trying to maintain its hold on power, right? To maintain its hold on the people, to spread the truth, the word, the gospel, to send the missionaries out. And that's where it comes from. And so thinking about that through line, the realization that anytime you have one of these major technological upheavals, you see struggles for power, questions about who controls narratives, questions about how does the public, like what role does the public play in relation to who has the power to spread a message. And interestingly, there's also a lot of people who write, kind of scholars of propaganda who write about the complete inability to separate the technology from the message, right? You can't actually differentiate these things because the content you produce is so shaped by the power that the technology gives you. And that's where you get at like media theory. And so I was very interested in understanding it more in those terms, as opposed to just this idea of misinformation or disinformation, which to me focused a little bit more on like the substance of what was being said, as opposed to the role that it played in society.
Yeah. So actually, I want to make a comment before I ask the next question, and that is that in ways that are truly remarkable, and that really this is a tickler for why everyone needs to pick up a copy of your book as soon as they get off the site.
Thank you.
is in ways truly remarkable. You became part of the story. So the
Yeah.
whole thing is extremely meta, right? And I don't mean that as a tone. But you are writing about this, learning about this, and you became part of the story in a way that I think that what you have to share with us is just the sort of the next level. It feels to me like you are so many miles ahead of the rest of us in really understanding the depths of the situation that we're in.
Well, so I got interested in the topic as a mom activist in California in 2013, and that was sort of how I opened the book. Or sorry, it was 2013, 2014. I had my first baby in 2013, and I was in tech. I had a startup. So all of my friends, many of my friends in San Francisco worked at social media companies. And I started writing about the experience of having my feed change, all of a sudden getting referred into online mom groups, specifically anti-vaccine mom groups, just that being like very much pushed to me, even though I didn't want it. I was very pro-vaccine, I've actually found it very irritating, to be honest. And writing about that experience and then the Disneyland measles outbreak. So it was kind of interesting. The book kind of opens with the Disneyland measles outbreak. Now we're in the middle of a measles outbreak in Texas, right? And and the book also goes through COVID, and so it tells the story of my experience being a pro-vaccine mom, very irritated by what was happening with measles exposures in California during Disneyland, and wanting to see the law change to require measles vaccines for kindergarten in public school, which was not a requirement when I first had my son, and getting involved in that process and realizing that the anti-vaccine movement had really established influencers, established online crowds, really understood how to work the algorithms of social media. Public health officials did not even bother. They didn't see a point. They just didn't see a point in even being in that conversation because they were like, well, we have websites.
They had their
Yeah,
platform.
people trust
Yeah.
the doctors. When we need to give a quote, we give a quote. When we need to give a press conference, we give a press conference. And so they just didn't see the point in participating. And there wasn't very much of a pro-vaccine parent movement because, like, why would there be? Because you would just go vaccinate your kid and nothing would happen and you would go on about your day. You wouldn't really tweet about it. You wouldn't say anything about it. And I liken it also to like there were flat earther groups, but no round earther groups, right? When you have like this, this thing that you're so passionate about, you start a group for it. If it's really not a thing that if it's like the norm, you don't.
Right.
And so it wasn't there. And so realizing that it was so asymmetric already and that we were so behind, and like writing about what that process was like of saying like, okay, we gotta do something about this, we gotta rectify this, just explaining like what it was like all of a sudden to need to start a group, like to try to like galvanize parents, which I feel like I'm doing now actually again in 2025, a decade later, where I'm like, hey guys, look who the Secretary of Health and Human Services is. Like he's a character in my book because we dealt with him in California in 2015, and trying to again that sort of person. I have three kids now, but writing about that need to make people realize that you have to be active because other people are. You don't get to sit back passively at this point. There needs to be some galvanization. Otherwise, in an age where you have the power to participate, I think it is so important to understand how other people are using that power and what happens when a vacuum is created and you don't use it. And I think
Yeah.
now you are starting to see public health officials and doctors and physicians who are very much entering the conversation. And so you're starting to see that balance tilt a little bit, but there is still a lot of kind of catching up to do.
We've definitely been slow to understand the influence of invisible rulers. Yeah. So everything old is kind of new again, but now we have a technology that's different, and we're trying to get our hands around it. So talk some about how the unique aspects of, the digital world that we're all in are accelerating and influencing this issue.
So technology moves very, very quickly. We had I think the blogosphere era of the internet, the idea that we were just connecting to each other, was maybe the early, like late 90s, mid 90s is kind of when it started for, I think, many people. There were always people on, bulletin boards and things earlier than that, but you see that the rise of social platforms, the sort of proliferation and acceleration of that, messaging groups. I think now we have what AI is making possible, generative AI, which intersects very heavily with how people engage as content creators. Anybody who wants to make a meme now can just kind of say what they want, describe it in words to any of 7 or 8 very easy to use platforms and get your image or video. So there's just a whole lot more power that the average ordinary person has in a way that was unthinkable even 2 years ago. I used to say, social media takes the cost of distribution to zero, but you still have to be a somewhat competent creator. You still have to know how to use these tools. Now that is significantly declining as well, right? You can make images. You're starting to be able to make pretty good videos. You can use AI to do all sorts of editing and things. It's just changing the ability to participate. And I think that is, whenever you change the tech, whenever you give people new affordances, you sort of change the rules of the game, you change the playing field. New people come in who are good at it. New types of manipulation emerge, right? That was sort of like my job at Stanford for 5 years, was looking at adversarial abuse. At Georgetown, I look at decentralized networks, like what does it look like when you take top-down control much more, like what happens when you remove it to the greatest extent possible and you see users on protocol-based platforms. So a little bit of research on what does that future look like. But anytime you shift the tech, you see new groups of people are ascendant, new types of creators become more popular, and that's what we're seeing with AI now too.
So if you, maybe this is a silly question, but if you were to kind of compare radio to the internet coming in, I mean, when you think about it, really, they're just the idea that radio existed was huge at the time. Amazing things could happen, right? Would you say that you'd say they're similar in sort of earth shattering, or are we?
Well, there are these. No, I think I would say there's. I tell the story of Father Coughlin in the book, right? So you have obviously FDR in the fireside chats is a thing. I think most people who have taken a history class in high school remember the story of the president using this new medium to speak to people, and they would gather in their living rooms, and that would be a big moment for the family. Everybody would sit and listen to this, have this experience. It brought people together into the living room. It was a thing where families would come together at that time. It was a more communal experience potentially than reading the newspaper more individually, unless someone was reading aloud. So you have the way in which it just shifts who comes over and gathers around this, to have these moments. Father Coughlin becomes an interesting case, though, because he's a Catholic priest, begins to develop fascist sympathies, right? He becomes quite pro-Hitler, pro-Mussolini, begins to sort of speak and praise them on his weekly radio addresses. He has, I think it was 30 million listeners at a time when the population of the U.S. is about 120 million people. It's a massively popular figure. Yeah, so this is at his peak, he is a wildly popular figure. So it's not that we haven't had wildly popular demagogues before. This is not an unheard of problem. But what is interesting, and the reason I used Coughlin to kind of like, I work his story in through one of the chapters to talk about solutions, actually specifically, is that you see in this moment the struggle to try to figure out, like, what do you do about this guy, right? The president doesn't want to intervene. He definitely doesn't want to look like he's using his power to silence a critic. There are concerns about civil liberties, right? Freedom of speech. There are the broadcasters who control the airwaves, try to figure out what to do, much the same way the social media platforms try to figure out what do you do in these situations. They have fact checkers, and have a guy who comes on after him and reads, sorry, Father Coughlin lied to you about the following things, right? And
wow.
No, it's interesting. You can actually pull up, like in the New York Times, they have the archives. They're nicely online now, so you can actually go, you can search his name, and you can read the media coverage as they tell the story. Actually, they tell it quite bluntly. I have to say, like, one thing that's always interesting about reading media coverage is they don't mince words, They're pretty blunt about what's happening. Father Coughlin lied to you. Here's how. The following things were wrong. It's not like we're using euphemisms and trying to be nice about it. His followers protest when these things begin to happen. They try to get him to pre-clear his speeches. He tries to push back against that. They do occasionally take him off the air. In order to seem fair, they give his hour-long slot to a different Catholic priest or a different religious priest, roughly of the same
So
denomination.
precursor of the fairness doctrine.
Yeah, the whole thing. Yeah, the fairness doctrine actually comes out of this. This is what happens. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting history that comes out of like this guy and all the things that they try to figure out, like, what do you do about this guy? The Institute for Propaganda Analysis emerges. You've got these academics who try to figure out, like, all right, from a civil society response, instead of fact checking his individual claims, can we help people recognize the rhetoric, right? Because if you look at fascist rhetoric, there are certain types of phrases that are very common, certain ways of othering people, certain lofty claims that are made. And so they start annotating his speeches just to point out very common types of language that he's using, very types of rhetorical tricks, of logistical fallacies. And so they're doing that, and they're literally passing these things out to kids in school and to people at the community centers. This is like an educational framework that's not fact checking. It's not like he got this thing wrong. It's much more, here's how you recognize what this kind of rhetoric appears as. Eventually, though, just to, answer the question to like end the story, it's the Catholic Church that ultimately yanks him, right? And so it is the correction from within his own community that is what ultimately kind of solves the problem, if you will. And so it is a bit of an unsatisfying ending, I think, from the parallel standpoint, because it is this point of like the correction comes from the norms of the community self-policing and saying, okay, you're done. And that I think is so for all the efforts that these different other groups try to make, whether it's, kicking him off, leaving him on, all these different attempts, it ultimately winds up being the church exerting its influence that ultimately makes the sort of final determination.
Which seems kind of worrisome in times when institutions are under a lot of threat.
Yeah.
So I want to pull a couple of it's an incredible discussion in the book about Father Coughlin as just sort of an important case study in early propaganda, and also in how much so many of the ways that you fight this are things that they already know. I mean, and you pulled a lot of the wisdom out of that experience. But the one thing I want to focus on is just to have a discussion kind of about how human nature plays into this. And importantly, Father Coughlin was tapping a lot of real
resentment,
feelings and anger and like real things that were important that he tapped into. So talk some about, what you've learned about how human nature is a real part of this.
Yeah, so it doesn't emerge in a vacuum. I mean, propaganda works when it works because there is a real sentiment that it is tapping into. In this case, this is, the Great Depression, the forgotten man. That is who he is speaking for, right? He's a Catholic priest, and so he has that credibility. He doesn't start off as a fascist. He starts off as a person who is originally a supporter of Roosevelt, who becomes very, very disillusioned and sort of goes down this, eventually makes his way down that path, but becomes quite a prominent critic. And so he has this sort of very populist, speaking for the people who are struggling under the Great Depression. And that is where, again, the very real problems that people are experiencing give that resonance before he goes off the rails. And so that's where you see that that initial audience building and support and love and trust comes in. Also is the imprimatur of like being a priest, right? So there's a sort of natural sort of authority and trust that goes with that. But there is this, that's where a lot of him and that parallel you see in a lot of other ways too today, this notion of, with influencers, what Renee says about invisible rulers in 1929, both in the context of marketing and politics, is that the good ones know how to appeal to you in your role as a member of a group, your identity as a member of a group. And you should always, whether you're selling them, he talks about cigarettes, helping. There's an example in the book, in not my book, in in Propaganda, which is I think like behind me on the shelf somewhere, um, where he wants to sell cigarettes to women. They want to, this is like teaching women to smoke essentially. And so he brands them like torches of freedom, right? You want to be liberated, right?
Ah,
You want that the sophisticated woman smokes, the liberated woman smokes, right? This is the association that you want to have with this product. And so it's appealing to your self-identity as that type of woman, right? And that is the association that the good marketer, the good invisible ruler is going to create. And that's the so there's always this notion that by appealing to that common identity, and the way that I describe it in the book is the notion of like the faction, right? People will self-select online. They'll throw an emoji in their bio now, right? You're constantly declaring who you are. If you're not going looking for it, an algorithm will sort you into it, right? And so that constant reinforcement into that group identity that becomes so important. And then one thing that you see in social psychology is the dynamics around groups tending towards taking on the characteristics of the most, the loudest, the purest, right? The most like ideologically pure. And you see that happen online also. The people who maybe are caricatures of a political identity where you meet the average Republican or Democrat or progressive or what have you on the street, they're not that hyper hyper caricatured figure that you see on social media, but on social media, you're rewarded for performing that extremism. And that's what, and that extreme version of that identity. And that's what you see. And so that's where that association is created and actually kind of like pulls people in that direction if they want to be seen as good members of the group, to receive credibility within the group, to be rewarded for participating as a member of the group. And it's really interesting to watch the intersection of human nature, the real concerns that people have, the real things, like they're talking about real issues, right? Things that
yeah.
they actually do care about, but then also the incentives of what social media drives them to do, so far as both the type of content they create, what they're rewarded for creating, and how they're rewarded for behaving.
Yeah. So this is kind of one of my hobby horses in that my first professional job was I was a therapist and did family systems therapy and group therapy. And one of the things about the moment that we're in is I feel like we are way underplaying how powerful the influence of groups are in the current situation that we're in. And so to me, online, especially, but I mean, it's true in person as well, that we are so impacted in our behavior by groups. And this is all of us. Like it's easy to see this in people on the other side, right?
Yeah.
And think, oh, well, yeah, they're just being, it's groupthink. But all human groups do this. They just do. They grow more extreme in the direction of the majority view to the point of actually misunderstanding factual reality. And so if we're going to, address things like this, we have to be very conscious of the composition of our groups. We have to, I love the old concept of the Queen's loyal opposition. That if I'm going to make a big decision, I want to hear somebody telling me why I'm wrong about it.
Yeah, I think that dynamic, we're even moving into separate platforms now. And you see that because it does the problem that you have on social media, I think, is that the vitriol extends into the real world and people know that, right? And it carries with it a risk. And so, yeah, I've been yelled at on the internet for the better part of a decade now. From 2015 and the vaccine thing to, to like, I never really did kind of finish your question, but like to getting, like tarred by Congress and, sued by Stephen Miller, subpoenaed by Jim Jordan, all the stuff in the right wing kind of smear machine that went
And,
after me for the work on the election and stuff.
And also to
Um,
pause for a second, I'd use some quotes to share to publicize this program about how you're a hero. You really have been a hero in that you have stuck with this work, stuck with. I mean, a lot of people might have just said, "Yeah, that's it, I'm done." But you've done it in a way that's really important to the rest of us.
no, I appreciate that. I think after a decade, I I don't mind the yelling, I have to say. The yelling really doesn't bother me at all at this point. Like there's nothing I see on the internet where sometimes I fight back, right? Like you just like clap back and this is how you engage on the internet and this is where we are. Um the people who like go real life are the ones where you're like, okay, do we, the thought that you have to like when I talk to people who are like, oh, I'm in public health, I want to engage more online. And, the primers that we give people are like, okay, well, like you should start Googling yourself. Is your address findable? Are pictures of your kids on the internet? Like it's weird to have to tell somebody if you want to talk about your work, you should make sure there's no pictures of your children on the internet. Like that is a very bad place for us to be because the problem there is that like you're chilling speech and you're pushing people out of the conversation because you're making it feel too risky to participate. And that is actually in fact the intent of that behavior. That is why they do it. And so I think that aspect of the harassment component that goes along with it is where you get beyond just strident expressions of like bad opinions, right?
Yeah.
Which like fine, we can have bad opinions, we can yell at each other, this is in the realm of political discourse, fine. But it's when it begins to feel threatening that you see people withdraw, and then that creates even more of a vacuum where you have even more of the people who are willing to behave in the worst possible ways are rewarded, and again that type of dynamic becomes ascendant. So I think for this question of what how do we like you want to incentivize people to participate, but what we're seeing now is because of that dynamic that it's not a public square, it's a gladiatorial arena, that feeling that if you're on certain platforms you're more at risk means that people increasingly gravitate to platforms where they feel like they're not going to get flack, and that means that they're almost also not going to hear pushback. And that's so that is the trade-off, right? You're not going to get yelled at, you're not going to get doxxed, you're not going to have like weirdos making threats, but you're probably also not going to see a very, you know, unfortunately, like what you want to do is have that interesting diversity of opinions, but without all the without all the
Yeah.
like the bad people, without all the trolls.
Yeah, that's true. So it almost anywhere that you go out, except the Village Square, I might add. But almost just so many of the places you go out and you seek those kinds of opinions, you're right, it comes with the icky stuff when I think it didn't
No,
at
it
a
doesn't
certain
in the
point in
real
time.
world, right? I mean, it really doesn't in the real world, actually. I live in DC, right? You're surrounded by many people with, all sorts of
Yeah.
opinions. And um, it is very interesting here. You'll have conversations with people who are on the complete opposite side of a legislative or policy issue who will very candidly say, like, look, I'm going to absolutely destroy your article on that. It's not personal, but, like, I'm sorry, that terrible opinion can't be allowed to stand, right? And that's fine. I mean, it's policy. People fight hard. But it doesn't turn into like a personal attack, right? And that I think it's like, how do you have a constructive disagreement? How do you have something where you're debating an idea? How do you have something where you're engaging around a perspective as opposed to what you see on social media, where the term that we use is nut picking, where you'll see somebody who will take a random person and make them the main character of the day by saying, like, look at this person's terrible opinion. But what they're really doing is sending a mob after that person, right? They're holding them up as an avatar of like, this is some idiot progressive, or this is some crazy conservative. And that is the intent, in fact, is to send the mob after that person. And they do it by finding a ridiculous statement or opinion, or and unfortunately that became, I think, very much a norm on a platform like Twitter. And this is where you see people beginning to say, like, it's just not worth engaging, I'm just going to go somewhere else.
It almost seems like it's become kind of a societal norm in a way. I mean,
Yeah, no, it came
when
into the
you
real
turn
world.
on,
Yeah,
yeah,
100%.
yeah, you turn on different, you choose your news sources and you'll get like a set of nut picking things, right? And then we, it does feel, I mean, it feels like we're falling for it.
Yeah, no, it is very true because again, I think it's always easier to attack the source versus the opinion, or it's easier to attack the person as opposed to the argument. And that is very much, whatever it is, whether it's, I remember when I did the research on, like when the Senate asked me to do that Russia research that you mentioned in the bio, it was like, here's this data set, massive data set, attributed by the tech platforms, not by me. I didn't pick this stuff and say it's Russian. They did, right? I never said it swung the election. It was a very, I think honestly, fairly mundane report. Like here's some descriptive statistics. Here's what it is. Here's how it worked. Here's what it did. And it was provided to the Senate so that they could then fold it into their report. So my report informed the Senate Intelligence Committee's report. But it did say that there was a very, very clear and unequivocal preference for Donald Trump and against Hillary Clinton. There is no possible way to look at that data and come to any other conclusion. It is just not a partisan thing to say. Nonetheless, the easiest way for them to respond to that, unfortunately, was to crawl through my political donations and see that I made one political donation once to Hillary Clinton, once during the primary, and then I became Clintonite operative Renée DiResta, and like that was it, right?
Yeah.
And that is how it's done. And so, again, like I said, I've been doing this for a decade now. It's not a surprise to me. I understand that this is how it is done. But what's very interesting is that I don't know that the public understands that that is how it is done. And so one of the reasons why I write so much about this, or why whenever I get hit piece media inquiries, which again is just part of the job, I screenshot them and I post them to social media, both with the inquiry from the reporter and then my response in full, right? Because they're only going to take 2 sentences if they even quote at all, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, let me explain what is actually happening in this interaction. Let me explain to you how a story like this is actually constructed. I want the public to understand how the media operates in these moments, and like what is actually happening here, and the incentive for them, the incentive for me, and what is actually happening in this exchange. Because I think that transparency is actually the best option that we have, where I don't have to ask that reader to trust me. I'm just saying, here it is. I'm laying it all out. You can form your own opinion, but this is the full engagement here. Here is their full article, and you can decide for yourself, like, who to trust in this encounter. And that's
Yeah.
really all I can do. So
Yeah. And of course, part of the problem is that, as you described, the people who've just had enough are sort of checked out
yeah,
for understandable reasons. And
totally.
and you talk a lot in the book about how we're getting a very incorrect picture of the numbers of people on extreme sides of our polarization, that
Yes.
it gets confusing because, like you said, if you just had a normal experience, you're not really online doing it.
Right. Exactly. I think that it's the we call it majority illusion sometimes. That's one of the ways to describe it. You can if you have a whole lot of people who are very quiet and six very, very loud people, and you're only seeing the posts from the six very, very loud people, and they have a completely different opinion than all the very, hundreds of very, very quiet people, you're going to assume that the majority opinion is those six loud people. And this is a thing that social media, unfortunately, really reinforces that perception, because what is curated, like, first of all, people have to be posting in order for you to see it. So there's this phenomenon in social media, social networking, the 90/9/1 problem, where 90% of people do nothing, 9% kind of lurk and participate occasionally, and 1% produce the overwhelming majority of the content, right? So you have that dynamic of like, who is creating the stuff that you might see anyway. Then you've got, are the people who are creating the stuff good at being sensationalists? And influencers often are, right? That is one of their skills. They know how to create something that resonates. So you have a lot of things stacking up that make people form perceptions of what the average person believes that is actually not true at all. And you can see this reflected when people get into actual polling data, but you don't see it in your day-to-day life. And so you can form like a very incorrect belief about what the average person thinks or what the majority opinion is.
And then that leads to, condescension, anger,
Right.
increasing,
Yeah.
and building. It's funny because I also thought about I mean, one of you remember like the viral emails that used to go around? That seems so quaint now,
Oh,
doesn't
chain letters. Yeah. Yes. Or Nigerian princes. Yes.
it? Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
they were important and powerful politically. And partly because you felt like somebody that gave you that information, right? That they're closer to you somehow. And now we have to deal with not just an email, but everyone, like the spreadability of it. I can't remember exactly how you describe that just we're now talking everybody to everybody, which seems pretty unmanageable.
I think it's the many to many. Um, it's the question of, you know, who do you, I think there's an interesting question of like, who do you think you're speaking to when you're on social media? I struggle with that sometimes. I wonder, there are certain platforms where I think, okay, this is, um, I am aware that it is public, but I've definitely had a couple things where I've said something that I think is just sort of funny and off the cuff, and it's wound up like embedded in a news article, and I think like, oh God. I wouldn't have used those words if you had called me for a quote, right? Because you speak in different tones and different phrasing and like your context when you're putting something out for an audience of the extremely online is different than if you think of it as like this is going to wind up in the New York Post or the Washington Post, right? And
And
you're
almost
you're
like it's
engaging very
intimate, right? Like
differently.
it's a private
Yeah, it's right.
conversation.
It's not even no, I know that it's definitely not private for me anymore, but but I think of it more as speaking to people with whom I have some sort of relationship, right? There's like a follow, like I speak with them quite regularly. Like I like to talk to people on social media. I talk back and forth constantly. Actually, I don't just use it as a broadcast tool. So when it gets taken out of that conversational context and I find it used somewhere else, it feels ever so slightly jarring to me because it's been decontextualized. And then it usually has my title attached after it also, which is like, you know, and I just think like, okay, if you'd called, like, did I just mute myself? No. Okay.
No.
Where you just feel like, you present differently somehow. And I think that question of who are you in what moment, in what context is, social media makes that a little bit weird. And I think people who are influencers or content creators, and I don't consider myself that, but people who do that, like they do have that sort of always on relationship where they present and they engage very differently than media, which broadcasts to somebody, and the influencer is constantly talking with somebody. And I think for people who either spend a lot of time on social media or were like just digital natives, there is that feeling that you're having a constant intimate conversation with your 100,000 closest friends. Um, but it still feels different somehow than writing something and posting it somewhere, I guess.
Yeah, it really does. There's something pretty unique about it. When my kids, when we let them go on Facebook, we basically said we were their first friend because they had a tendency to think that this is a place I can be away from my mother, you know. And said, yeah, you got to friend me first. Sorry.
Yeah,
But I think it's the same.
mine are not old enough to be on. My oldest is 11. But they consume it at 11, which is interesting. Like YouTube is really the thing. I've been surprised at how much, like what a big role YouTube plays in the lives of middle schoolers, just as far as they watch streamers, they like to play video games, and they watch streamers who play the video games better than them, and then they talk about what the streamers do. And and you as a parent are responsible for knowing like which streamers are like G or PG versus like weird, you know.
That's really hard. And so
Yeah.
it basically propagandizes through some of the same.
Yeah, because they never
Yes.
just stay on topic with the video games, right? Either your kid is also going to get exposed to whatever else, like whatever other chatter makes their way, into other topics of conversation. So live streams are a no, but YouTube video clips of streams at least are, you can read a transcript and like kind of clear it. But again, that only lasts so long until they're a little bit older, and then it winds up being you're just trying to give them good life advice on how to think about how to listen to and engage in spaces. Speaking of, my 4-year-old just wandered in. I'm going to try to move her away from the mic.
Oh, that's the best part. Pets and kids are the best part of the Zoom life. So actually, I'm kind of surprised that this hasn't that you still are so digital and involved in social media. It hasn't turned you off to it. So two-part question. It hasn't, and why? And then maybe like what are your rules going to be, do you know, when they're old enough to be online?
Yeah, no, I've been on I got my first blog when I was in like 4th or 5th grade. So let me sorry, I'm just like work her out of
I love that. I love
the hand.
It's great.
I know, it's like that she's she's got the same energy of like that little kid who like, came in with the guy on that BBC presenter when we were all home during COVID, and she really is like that. That is my third child is like very very boisterous little kid. But no, her dad just got her. She's out.
Oh, darn.
I'm like, you're on duty. Where are you? No, I feel like I have always really enjoyed it. It is where I get information from, make friends, find interesting topics. Like it's my default for if I have time to kill, there's always something interesting to see or read or do. I really genuinely enjoy it. There are a lot of, like I said, over the last decade, there are blips where, you're like, okay, Clinton Knight operative Renee DiResta time again, but can't let that ruin it all. With the kids, I think that I think about a little bit differently. Again, social media didn't exist when I was in middle school or high school. Their blogs did, right? America Online and like chat rooms and, bulletin boards and stuff did, but the visual component wasn't really quite the same. It wasn't like kind of algorithmically pushing you down weird rabbit holes. There weren't filters. You weren't constantly videotaping yourself or like posting lives or whatever. So we don't really love that, and I'd like to keep them out of that for as long as possible. So I teach them how to use it more as a content tool. Like my son loves to code. My daughter really loves art and music. She's actually in a Procreate class right now. She still does like Outschool and stuff. So they're very hands-on, and they use a lot of tools. We just try to keep them away from the self-esteem crushing stuff. Like I would rather they be outside playing with the neighbors' kids than and like sitting around on Instagram, and they play Fortnite, but only with like chat turned off and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Well, so I want to remind people that if they've got questions for you, we'll turn to questions shortly. That just pop it up in the Q&A, and then I want to ask maybe spend a little bit of time on some of the solutions to the challenge, and one principle that you discussed that seemed really important and that seems like it's easy to get confused by is that it's not that a lot of times really what we're talking about is limiting reach of accounts, and that we aren't it's not speech, it's reach that's the issue. Say more about that.
So the freedom of speech, freedom of reach distinction was something that Asa Raskin and I were writing about around 2018. It wasn't a moderation debate actually at the time. It was a curation debate. It was the question of like, how do platforms think about what to uprank or downrank? Because the one thing that I think, again, people hear that and they think that there's some sort of plot or like thing that we are arguing should be amplified or suppressed. No, every single social media platform with a feed is ranked and there is no neutral. And I think that people are surprised when they hear that because they think that there is some baseline neutral and like reverse chronological feeds. Reverse chronological feeds are perhaps as neutral as it gets, but the fact is people don't like them and platforms don't use them. And they are always trying to default you to move you back away from reverse chronological. And that's because reverse chronological, it actually incentivizes spammy behavior by users. Because then people will post constantly to try to
So that
be
it's at
that
the
top
top.
post. Yeah. And so that's one of the reasons why, as much as people might say like, oh, I want a reverse chronological feed, if that was the default, again, whenever you change a default, whenever you shift a technology or a ranking algorithm, people will adapt very quickly to game the new system. And so one of the things that we wrote about was the need for transparency. So when a platform is making a determination about what to uprank or downrank, and again, the other thing that people have to understand is that the free speech rights on social media belong to the platform legally. And this is another thing that I think is there's like some gaps in understanding around. They might adhere to the general value of trying to maximize free expression by not taking content down, which I absolutely support. But when it comes right down to it, the platform gets to decide how it's going to curate, what it's going to uprank, whether it's going to allow you to be on there, what it's going to surface. And it has an incredible amount of power. And so one of the things that I've written about over the years is the problem of that unaccountable private power, because it has it, but it's very not transparent and users have very little control. And so if it chooses to use it in certain ways, I have argued that it should be transparent about how. So Elon put freedom of speech, not freedom of reach. It's actually his content moderation framework, which was really very surprising to me. Like you never know where your work's going to wind up, right? But there it is. And it was because he pointed out to his user base 100% correctly that it is really the only thing that you can do because there is always a weighting function, always a ranking function, and someone somewhere is deciding what is going to get surfaced. And so what he said is we're going to allow certain types of content, including hate speech, to stay up on the platform, but we are not going to give it widespread amplification. And that I think is really, now again, not every platform has to make that decision. And I think the value of the free speech rights being with the platform is that every platform can and does make that determination for themselves. So there's actually a really interesting sentence in Rumble's terms of service. Rumble is kind of like a right-wing flavored YouTube. Rumble has a, you can't post content that glorifies or supports Antifa. Now, this is a term of service that exists in like no other platform. And I love that for them. I think it's fantastic. You know, it's just such a weird niche thing.
Yeah.
But like,
These
God
are our
bless them
rules.
for it. Yeah, these are our rules, you know, our site, our rules. And if you don't like it, you don't have to post on Rumble. You can go post your pro Antifa video on YouTube or wherever else you want to post it. And so I think that understanding of like, we should want to see a proliferation of platforms. Like we should want to see a lot of social media platforms. We should not want all that power to be concentrated in three. We should understand that when they have that power, they should be made to be as transparent as possible. I think that legally that is where the regulation should be. That transparency should be compelled. And I think we should also want to see legally and perhaps compelled as much granularity of user control as possible. And you can do that through things like mandated interoperability. So there's a variety of ways in which you can try to encourage giving more control to the user so that the user can say, I want to uprank this, I want to downrank that. And that also gives more power to the user as opposed to creating this illegitimate feeling system of like someone is deciding what I see. So that is how I tend to think about these things. And that is where that freedom of speech, not freedom of reach argument really came from this, you know, everybody's arguing that like it's this binary question of, we're arguing about freedom of speech on social media. No, that wasn't what people were actually fighting about. They were really fighting about who got attention and whose content landed on the top of the feed. That was the fight that people were having. And so if we were going to talk about it, we should talk about it in those terms. I completely agree. But then you had to understand that there's no such thing as neutral, and we should have like a clear set of like a clear framework for understanding like what that meant and how users could have more power and visibility on platforms that are centrally controlled by, unaccountable private power.
Yeah. And you also talk about the importance of transparency in the government's role.
Yeah.
In terms of taking down content, that's been a problem in the past, that they haven't been transparent enough.
So I say most, can't say all. Many governments, these are global platforms. It's the other thing that when we talk about who has free speech rights, other governments can and do request content takedowns with some regularity. Right now, there's a conflict happening between India and Pakistan, right? And the Indian government is rather notorious, actually, for requesting content takedowns when it considers the Modi government, when it considers it to be in their interests. And you will see that happen somewhat, not infrequently, I should say. The government of Turkey recently requested that some content be suppressed on Blue Sky, which is a smaller, newer platform, right? And so Blue Sky has labelers that indicate what, that essentially will geofence content. So users in Turkey could not see the offensive tweets that the government requested be blocked. Now, they still stay up for users outside of Turkey, but users in Turkey can't see them. Or users in Turkey using clients that use that labeler cannot see them. So there's a variety of ways in which this happens. Now, some platforms, and in the United States, you will see the government occasionally reach out to tech platforms. And the question of do they actually explicitly request a takedown, that doesn't happen very often. It's actually kind of anomalous. What they'll more often say is like, hey, you see this happen like during COVID. This kind of content seems like it would be hurting people, or like, why is this still up? Like this was the Biden, like you're killing people, during COVID. This actually was a case that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ultimately found that the plaintiffs didn't have standing to bring the case. These plaintiffs who alleged that the government had requested that their content come down. Turned out that in discovery, there was no evidence that the government had requested that these plaintiffs' content come down. So SCOTUS tossed the case for standing. And I think I wrote about that in the book. I think the Murthy case I'm trying to remember if it had been decided or if just...
I think it hadn't been decided.
Maybe arguments had been heard. Well, before the paperback, that will be one of the updates that goes in. But what wound up happening was like it got tossed for standing because discovery turned up no evidence that these plaintiffs, that the government had ever made any requests with respect to them whatsoever. It was like the flimsiest evidentiary basis ever. And so unfortunately, honestly, like it would have been nice to hear them weigh in on where that line is with what's called jawboning. If the government actually did make a request, where should that line be? So one thing that you can argue, even independently of the fact that we have no actual good court case to litigate on this, is just that generally speaking, you could pass a bill that says, when a government is making a takedown request, there should be a transparency disclosure posted by the company. Google and some other companies do this when it comes from governments, including the US government. You can actually see it. There are public databases for it. So I think that that's the kind of thing where you could create regulation around it. Yes.
So anything else that you want to make sure that you get in terms of things that you think are solutions to the challenge ahead of us?
I am a huge evangelist for platforms like Blue Sky, not because it's lib Twitter. I wish it had more conservatives on it, honestly. Again, not because I think that mostly because I think that it's one of the few places where you have users actually have that granular control. And I really do want to see more people realize like what you can do when you have that empowerment. And I would love to see it be a place that is not lib Twitter, again, because I think it is the most technologically interesting place on the internet right now from a, like, here's the thing that everybody said they wanted, like, we can have it now. you want a social media feed not controlled by Mark Zuckerberg, like here it is. Like we can build it. We actually can do this, guys. So that is, I think, something that it was just starting to get exciting when I was turning in the final manuscript. I think they were just crossing maybe like 15 million users or something. They're up to about 35 now. So it's come a long way. And then as far as other stuff, you know, I think just being aware of the new and novel ways in which I guess the interesting shifts that are happening with like how platform, or I should say big tech relationships with government, I think are like quite revealing right now in unexpected ways. And
Yeah,
I
actually,
think people are starting to see that. Even I was a little bit surprised by like some of the shifts and some of the very public capitulations that big tech made, that I actually kind of thought that they would stay more independent. And so to watch them really shift to be much more compliant this time around, because they did not do that in 2016. So I was a little bit surprised to see that. And again, this was where I was like, we really need to see much more independence from tech companies in this country.
So actually, that's an audience question: is what are the chances that Meta and Google will be transformed by antitrust prosecutions? Will these prosecutions even succeed in changing anything?
I don't know. I have been such a skeptic for so long that anything will actually ever happen with that. But, you know, one thing that is very interesting is like just how much Brendan Carr really can't stand them. And so when you have that like that energy and that drive, I'm very curious to see if he goes for it. Right. When you have Lena Khan getting photographed with Steve Bannon, these sort of, you know, the sort of populist antitrust on the right and the left, that interesting intersection there. It is very, you know, maybe there will actually be some momentum. That one I can't predict. I'm not a lawyer, and I honestly I stopped paying attention to that because it felt like a thing that was just never going to happen. But, you know, we also just got our first major piece of tech legislation passed last week. I think it was the Take It Down Act. Maybe it was a week and a half ago now. That's the one for non-consensual intimate imagery. So what are colloquially known as deepfakes or non-consensual revenge porn. That is now criminal at the federal level, which used to be patchwork of state laws. Now there's a federal statute for that. There's also a notice and takedown requirement in that law that makes tech platforms take down content within 48 hours when they receive a notice. There's some concern that it's going to be like copyright takedowns, where it's just going to be like overused and used to take down things that are not really non-consensual intimate imagery. So it'll be used to stifle expression in unexpected ways, or predictable ways. But you know, we are seeing the impact of that passed 409 to 2 in the House. Like, that is incredibly bipartisan. I'm shocked that it went through so fast. So we're starting to, you know, like I wouldn't have predicted that either, actually. So
yeah. So here, another audience question: do you see AI becoming an invisible ruler?
It is really capable of doing some interesting things on a psychological level that I don't think we have fully reckoned with yet. I don't know how many people followed this, but there was an interesting rollout that OpenAI made where they rolled out a model that was like very deferential in its engagement with its user. I don't know. Did you follow this? Did you see the story?
No, I did not.
So sometimes you'll ask, I don't know how often you engage with like ChatGPT. I have an account.
A little bit.
So sometimes you engage with an AI and it'll just give you a rather neutral response back. But sometimes, and whatever they did with this one, I didn't personally experience this, but it would be like almost like effusively praising, you know, like glazing is the slang, right? And also one of the things that it will do sometimes, and people were posting screenshots of this, is validating but validating things that are unhealthy to validate. So people were engaging with it once there was some inklings that this model was unexpectedly effusive and very weirdly so. They began to kind of poke at it to test it. And they posted as if they were, for example, schizophrenic, experiencing hallucinations, saying, talking about grandiosity and essentially working their way through the DSM manual, like laying out these things where another person, another human being, or a psychiatrist would push back a bit and indicate that maybe something was afoot. And instead, in this particular case, the AI is telling the person, like, oh, these hallucinations indicate that you're operating at a higher plane. And it really is just going down this validation rabbit hole of telling people that, they have a special connection to, to higher beings and really validating the sorts of things that one might not want validated. And so you do start to see some of these unintended areas, and other people have begun to write about this and to highlight areas where just these kind of unintended consequences. We've seen some impacts on like teen mental health with some of the AI chatbots. We've seen areas where they've taken teenagers into like kind of like adult content type situations, but this was sort of a new layer on the sort of the combination of the persuasive power of these things plus the unintended ways in which, without appropriate guardrails, they were doing some things that were like potentially like significantly unhealthy.
Yeah. So. Sure doesn't seem like human beings need more confirmation bias. It seems
right.
Like running all by ourselves.
Right. You don't need it to tell you like how fantastic you are and how you're never ever wrong. But that was the direction they took it. So
I wonder if we could have an AI platform that was the Queen's loyal opposition. That is like, it would
be more useful. I actually do that. I do that with mine a fair bit. Like I'll periodically upload an article before I post it and say like, what did I miss? Like what argument did I not address?
That's so great.
Well, but no, I mean, I do it almost more as like what are people going to tell me I'm an idiot about? What stupid logical mistake did I make in this argument here? Or like where is the or honestly, like just what argument would you make in response to this? What did I miss? It's actually a fairly good debate partner too. This is another thing that I've found as I've like done debate prep, but for various events and things like that. And I think if you use it in that way, it can be quite a valuable tool. Like I actually prefer it as a tool of pushback. I don't like it when it's whenever it says something like this is a very clear and concise essay. I'm like, yeah. I don't want to hear that. Like give me all the things that are bad,
Yeah.
Like I want an editor, not a complimenter. Yeah.
Yeah, I had suggested a while back that we should Facebook should have a depolarize me button and you can punch it.
So Google has this, there's this thing called the Habermas machine for anybody who wants to read an interesting paper. That Google DeepMind, their AI team, did in conjunction with Twitter's community notes. So Twitter's community notes only show up when a certain number of people across what the notes algorithm intuits to be the right and the left in the US or opposite sides of the spectrum agree that a note is valuable and neutral. And then, so this means though that because that agreement has to happen, a very low percentage of notes actually clear that threshold, something like 12%, 14%. It's very low. And so the idea behind the Habermas machine is that the AI can solve that problem, meaning it can actually rewrite things to be in more neutral language. This is a thing that an LLM can do quite easily. And so it could solve that neutrality issue, which might lead to a higher percentage of these things clearing if the objection is to neutrality in language. So there are some interesting ways in which you are seeing it being used exactly for that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. So we're getting questions about, what can regular people do in this environment? And here's one specifically. Given how toxic social media apps such as Facebook and X are, is the citizen's onus to refrain from feeding the beast by deleting our profiles, or do we have an obligation to stay online and engage in respectful way, even if um, if that if our feeds will likely have very little impact or notice given the algorithmic incentives? They're generally struggling with that dilemma. What do you do?
I engage on the ones where I feel like I also personally get value. So I don't really post on X anymore because I just stopped finding it enjoyable personally. The only time I'm on there or posting something is if I feel some sense of I need to do this for some reason. Like there is like a particular objective that necessitates me writing these words. Oftentimes that's a fact check, unfortunately, related to some stupid court case or whatever about me. Um, but the uh, but the rest of the time, I just don't find it that fun. Um, but there are other ones where I think you can engage, and sometimes that's you just have to decide how you want to. Some people feel quite happy just retweeting stuff that they think is even positive stuff, right? You don't have to retweet the rage content. You can find the people who are doing the bridging, right? The people who are, we call it like disagreement without being disagreeable, like the people who can articulate a point of view in a way that is constructive or friendly. And then there are, if you choose to post, you can decide when. You don't have to feel obligated. The question of like, not everybody wants to be on video, not everybody wants to post images. I do very rarely, almost never actually. I just prefer text, but it really is just a question of doing what feels right for you. If you have a field that all of a sudden becomes highly relevant, this is the one area where I would say like the doctors during the pandemic, right? Or something
Stick
like
with
that.
it
Where
then.
yeah, that's the one area where it's like all of a sudden your field is like highly relevant for this like several week period or something, or that's where like getting good information out there is highly valuable. But if it's just sort of being part of the discussion and the discourse and commentary, then do what makes you happy.
And there's you write about there's the propagandists are really good at propaganda, right? People who have knowledge base in a certain area aren't aren't necessarily good at it. So, I mean, given the fact that we're unlikely to put this technology back in the barrel, although I would vote to do it, you know, do we just have to get good at being able to use it? I mean, Village Square uses it in our work,
Yeah.
and we work really hard to be as good at it as we can be.
I mean, that's I do too. Again, I pick and choose also what are areas where I just use it as like a neutral broadcast tool. There's definitely areas still like I'm still a stridently pro-vaccine mom, right? There's been a lot of conversations about that lately with the stuff going on in Texas, and I absolutely weigh in on that.
Yeah.
Because I feel like actually in that particular case, um, there are a lot of people who I think are intimidated about being vocally pro-vaccine because they have seen, particularly during COVID, what that looks like sometimes in response, right? Like the responses that you get. And so I do feel like sometimes because I've done it for so long and I don't really care what the responses are going to like, it doesn't really phase me, that doing it almost is like modeling something or like lets people see that you can do
Yeah.
it, right? And so there's certain times when I know that there are other people who feel like that too, who've been in that conversation for a long time and feel like by being visible, they show people that they can do it also. And that I think might be another area where if you have some really strong tie to an issue, or you understand how to talk about an issue, or you're an identity that's particularly impacted by an issue, and you have a credibility then that comes with that. And you also understand the vocabulary to use that
Mhm.
goes with that. Because there are a lot of people who might want to speak up, but they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, or they don't feel like it's their fight, or they don't feel like qualified, or they're afraid that someone is going to tell them that it's not their fight, right? Because that happens a lot on the internet. And so I think that that is the other area where it opens the door, I think, for people to see that other people are having the conversation. And again, that's a question of, do you feel like it's something that fits the risk profile you're willing to take on, and then the topic that you're willing to be associated with. And then again, the recognition, unfortunately, that sometimes people will just decide that that your comment is sufficiently public that they can just take it and stick it in another place,
So be
which
ready
is a
for
thing that
that.
happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's a question from someone in the audience that's talking about, it's really easy to identify propaganda if it's on the other side.
Right.
But am I committing the same sin as intentional propagandist if I promote content that I support through social media? If I see something as evidence-based rather than rumor, is that okay? Where do you draw the line? I mean, so to me, there are lots of sites, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum. There's lots of websites, lots of information, lots of disinformation out there.
Yeah, so I tend to, when I go looking for an article to share about a news event or a topic, I do tend to default to looking for like Associated Press or Reuters, just as like the most fact-based neutral thing out there. Um, if I want to share something about a news event, I write commentary, like I write for The Atlantic and stuff, and so I understand that there will always be some component of persuasion, and some people will, that line is an interesting one. It is a blurry one at times. I personally try not, like, I don't love the hyper partisan content. Every now and then something will be so extraordinarily written where you're like, the prose. There have been a couple profiles, man, of like New York politicians in particular. I grew up in New York, so even though I don't live there now, but I spent 30 years there, and there's a profile of Anthony Weiner, man, that was just like, the writing was amazing. And that one, I mean, every now and then you get this writing. That one was in the that was New York Magazine, or the New Yorker. There were two that like came out, one of Weiner and I think now I'm gonna be embarrassed because I'm trying to remember if that was the New Yorker or New York. But anyway, it was an amazing shit, was it the Atlantic? Oh my God. Okay, now I'm gonna forget. I shared it and it was fantastic. I think it might have been the Atlantic.
I'm going to look it up just out of
Anyway,
curiosity.
oh my, no, it was just the most amazing writing.
Yeah.
But every now and then you're like, okay, the writing, like, yes, this is maybe in like an extremely like, none of those three pubs I think are particularly partisan. So maybe that was a bad example, but you get one sometimes where it's out there on one end of the spectrum, but the writing is so good that you want to share it. I don't know. I think there's no hard and fast rule with a lot of these things, and some people are very comfortable with a strong partisan identity, and they're just very transparent about it, right? Like, I am the person is a strong progressive Democrat, and they want to post that content because that is their values and they want to share it, and that is perfectly fine. And so I think that there's no rule about that. I think it is a question of, do you try to engage as honestly as possible with the facts? If something comes out where it's like quite clearly not the case, that, the rumors that Trump stole the election in 2024 were going around the fringe for a while in the 2 weeks after Election Day. And one thing that I was actually very heartened by was the fact that they mostly stayed on the fringe, right? The what you might call the mainstream left did not pull them in. No major influencers picked them up. No Democratic politicians amplified them.
Mhm.
And that was nice to see because it keeps it in the keeps it on the outskirts. It's there. Some people engage with it. Some people want to engage with it, but it doesn't get normalized. And I think that as long as it doesn't get normalized, then you still have a very healthy politics where the community is correcting itself. And that is, I think, a very important place to be, regardless of, again, that's just an example of the Democrats in this particular election. But that model, I think, is what you want to be looking for.
Yeah. So, how do you suggest trying to foster a relationship with someone who you see as all in on conspiracy and disinformation without risking every conversation devolving?
usually you have to have a strong personal relationship, and that's because there are there has to be something that makes both people want to maintain their relationship at that point. And there still has to be some sort of bond of trust and goodwill. So there has to be something that is keeping that going. And that this is where there are support groups online that you can find on Reddit. There was a big one for a long time called QAnon casualties, where it was people talking about losing relatives in the figurative sense to QAnon. And there were a lot of people who would discuss tips for how to engage with family members that they wanted to have a relationship with, but who had gone very far down the QAnon rabbit hole specifically. And they would try to share tips and tricks and ways of engaging. I don't have very much in the way of personal experience with that. But that is where I think the dynamic of that need for like the personal connection and the trust, and then having the support group to help you make sure that you're keeping a healthy sense of your own mental health and your own kind of balance in that relationship with that person, and having a source of support in how you engage is very, very important.
Yeah, I mean that's been so much of our lesson all these years is, and over the years, I have so many relationships with people who see things politically so differently than I do. And the relationship becomes so much more primary when you have it. And, our political differences are just like way down the list of things I care about. And that kind of relationship, maybe you're talking about blue sky being having some promise. Maybe we need to just come in pairs. Just bring one friend who disagrees with you politically and go on to blue sky and see what social media could be.
Yeah, I think it's the that feeling of how do you replicate the dynamics that you do have in the real world, where you don't ask somebody's politics the minute you walk into a cocktail party. You just have a conversation with them as a human being. Maybe you intuit it somewhere down the line, but it's not the most salient thing about them. You usually talk about culture. What movie, what TV show, do you have kids? What do you do? Where are you from? There's a million other things that you can get to where you can find some common ground or something to talk about before you get to, versus on Twitter, you've got your emoji in bio and you're like ready to fight the minute you see the other guy has the opposite one. So,
yeah. So my question is, obviously we're at a time of it's a tumultuous transition, and you focus a lot on that in the book, that we have to know that's what we're in right now. And that one of the things that we need during this time is we need a genuine desire to share the same reality. That really struck me. I wanted to give you, a moment to be able to kind of pitch why that's so important. And
I was thinking about this. Do you remember the movie Don't Look Up? It was from a couple of years back. I was thinking about this again. It somehow popped up in my feed. I think it might have been on Blue Sky actually the other night. I got asked during the promos of that movie to do like the scientist react thing. And I was very like nervous about it at the time because I was somewhat new to academia. I wasn't a scientist. I felt really weird being asked to be a scientist. They had real scientists and then me. I was like the social media person. And then there were like actual climate scientists. And then but what I remembered about it was feeling like, and this was, God, I'm trying to remember where it was timed relative to like COVID. I think it was maybe right like during mid to late COVID, if I recall correctly, but 2021 maybe. But but what was interesting about it, I was thinking about it again the other day, and just the I remember saying like, oh, it feels like a documentary. He's like there yelling at his computer, the scientist who's saying like the asteroid is coming. For those who don't know, it's a story about these scientists who realize that an asteroid is going to hit Earth. They're 100% convinced. There's no doubt. The data is there. The asteroid does in fact hit Earth. Spoiler. But they're there and they're trying to convince the world that the asteroid is coming. And they have this populist president. The title is "Don't Look Up," and she's saying, "Don't look up, look forward." They are trying to keep you from focusing on the future. They're telling you there's no future, but there's a future for you. Don't listen to those egghead scientists. And people are denying this is going to happen. So I think the reason that this actually matters, to get to the point, is collective action, right? If you don't have a shared reality, then it's not so much the day-to-day little things that matter. I don't think it's the big things that matter. There is this book that I read, Benjamin Bratton's Revenge of the Real, and I'm like still envious of his title. But it's like the Philip K. Dick saying, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, continues to exist, I think I might have just
Oh, that's great.
But roughly speaking, that is the quote. And or reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. That is essentially the point. And you can argue about whether reality is socially constructed or who decides or this or the other thing. But the point is, you need to be able to take collective action in response to certain threats, whether that's a tornado or a pandemic or something that is going to happen to you, where it doesn't care if you believe in it or not. And that is, I think, the main problem that I think about a lot. This issue of when people can't agree on what is a fact or who is trustworthy or whether data is reliable. It's not so much the day-to-day adjudication or the small fights on Twitter or who owned who in what stupid online tiff. It's actually that question of how do you have the ability to take collective action when you need it. And so that is, I would say, the reason that I wrote a book on how do you restore consensus reality. I think that is actually like the reason that it matters. It's not the small little things. And yes, there have always been moments in history where reality is fractured and not everybody agrees on all of the things. But in these moments, I think that we are at particularly precarious places with regard to our ability to achieve collective action, because that the polarization that has resulted from this is so severe.
So that answer is beautiful and profound, and it's making me cry a little bit. Although it did make me wonder if I sounded like the agreeable AI cat.
No, I appreciate that. I was just
really
thinking about that. I just thought it was so funny to have that movie wind up in my feed, and I was thinking like, I actually went back and was trying to find that stupid Scientists React promo, because I was like, I wonder if I'm like less mortified by it now 4 years later than I was when I actually did it.
Yeah, I'll have to watch that again. That just a beautiful, and and my experience has always been that I always learn something from people who disagree with me politically. I always it's such a valuable interaction. So, thank you. This has been just an incredibly enlightening conversation. Again, everybody go get the book. And Renee, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy life. I know you're a very busy human.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
On behalf of our host, Florida Humanities, the Village Square, and our streaming partners, we'd like to thank you for joining us tonight, everyone. Good night.
That was a good night and a great conversation. I am such a fan of Renee DiResta's work, and she certainly did not disappoint here. So what can we do about disinformation, spam and scams, trolls, and online manipulation? One of the quotes Renee shared toward the end really drives home the whole point for me. And at the end of the day, as Renee quoted, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And I looked that up. It's actually attributed to the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. But let's face it, we're fighting an uphill battle. As Liz and Renee discussed tonight, the medium is the message. And that's not anything new. But the media platforms, social media, broadcast media, have built in incentives, as we know, to keep people on their platforms. It's part of their business model, to keep people on their platforms, to instigate engagement. And one of the proven parts of this business model, it is in social media, as well as traditional media broadcast and is by appealing to people's sense of anger and fear. This has been talked about a lot on this program. We know it. We know this. So for many of us who want to find diverse views, and there are more of us than what it looks like if you're only reading the comments section on a YouTube video or something. But for those of us who want to find diverse viewpoints to learn from and engage with, there is a risk to it because the extremists and the screamers really do take up so much of the oxygen. So we're going against the tide in many places, and we're going against tried and true tactics to degrade civic and civil dialogue, like nitpicking. Renee talked about this in her book, Invisible Rulers, and she brought it up tonight. Nitpicking, where someone brings up an isolated example of the most extreme version of a particular viewpoint, or the most outlandish or outspoken person who's representing a supposed side to this larger argument. And then that becomes the proxy for anyone who's not aligned with the opposite side of whatever argument that might be. And that's just not the way to do democracy. But we do have a better way. We have examples of how to do this better, whether it's someone like Yasha Monk, who's, I think it was 2023 when his book, The Identity Trap, came out. He starts every chapter in that book with a nuanced and fleshed out articulation of different scholars and leaders' positions that he then engages with, mostly to disagree. But by giving a more full and fair representation of those views, his arguments are then much more robust. I think of writers like E.J. Dionne. He does that very regularly, sharing the strongest perspectives from an opposing view. You can hear it in the way great thinkers like Jonathan Rauch and Pete Wehner, who happen to be dear friends, they speak to each other about faith. John is an avowed atheist, while Pete is a devoted, lifelong Christian. And yet they're dear friends who can have wonderful conversations about religion, about faith, about Jesus. And then it shows up in John's book. It doesn't tear John and Pete apart. It actually deepens and enriches their relationship, and they learn something from each other. You definitely saw that in John's latest book, the fruit of those kinds of conversations. And that points to one of the final points that really resonated with me. That is the question about how to engage with people we strongly disagree with, such as those, for example, who are deep into conspiracy theories and have really bought into certain lines of misinformation. And the answer is that it starts with a strong relationship. Having a relationship with someone gives us a much more stable human context to be able to explore the more difficult issues. Relationships give us so many more connecting points that where there are differences, even grave differences, we have all those other points of connection, and we have the value of the relationship that transcends the differences, and maybe even the fertile ground to be able to persuade our friends and loved ones. And with that, it's time to close out today. Please consider joining our members and supporting this programming. You can become a member for just $7 a month or $76 a year. Your business can join for $250. Go to villagesquare.us/donate to join today. Again, that's villagesquare.us/donate. And I'm just going to underscore this point. Your donations, your contributions have never meant more. They've never been more important. So while you're there, sign up for Village Square's newsletter to stay up to date with everything happening at the Village Square. It's really easy to sign up for this newsletter because you get the pop-up thing every time you go to the website. It's great. Just go to villagesquare.us. You'll see the pop-up, or when you're on the site, scroll down to the bottom for that sign-up box as well. Funding for this program was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. We appreciate you listening to Invisible Rulers with Renee DiResta. Until next time, we challenge you to reach out with an open heart and mind to someone who doesn't look or think like you. It changes everything. We'll talk to you soon, and thanks so much for listening to Village Squarecast.